Welcome back to the podcast from Responsible Raw Materials, where we explore the people, perspectives and ideas shaping the future of where our raw materials come from and how we keep them in circulation. Today's episode is a fascinating one because it steps slightly outside the disciplines we might traditionally associate with raw materials and into the world of psychology. I'm joined by Geertje Schuitema, a psychologist originally from the Netherlands, now based in Ireland, whose work focuses on something absolutely central to the future of raw materials, and that is, how do people think, behave, and respond to change? In this conversation, we explore how public perception shapes the extractives industry, from the way communities respond to projects to how wider society influences politics, regulation, and ultimately the future of mining itself. Geertje takes us through her journey from growing up in a part of the Netherlands that was closely linked to natural gas production, to researching electric vehicles in Aberdeen at a time when EVs were still highly unusual, and later looking at public acceptance of smart meters and renewable technologies in Denmark and Ireland. What's particularly interesting is that much of her work centres around a key question, and that is, how do people respond to technologies and industries they don't fully trust or perhaps even understand? And that leads us into some really important discussions around communication. We talk about why simply giving people more information doesn't necessarily do the trick, and why trying to convince people can sometimes be the wrong approach entirely, and why listening, genuinely listening, may actually be one of the most important tools we have. Perhaps most importantly, we explore what responsibility really means. Because, as Geertje points out, responsibility isn't just about complying with regulations or staying within ESG frameworks. It's also about integrity, honesty, transparency, and whether people feel that organisations are genuinely adding value to society. It's a thoughtful, slightly different conversation. I hope you enjoy it. So, Geertje, we're sitting here in beautiful Barcelona, in the shade, hiding from the sunshine, but overlooking the glorious blue of the Mediterranean. One or two aeroplanes flying overhead, but it's a very nice place to be, isn't it?
Yes, lovely.
And what brings us here?
So we're here at the geochemistry conference, and of course, I'm a psychologist by training. So your next question is going to be, what is a psychologist doing at a chemistry conference?
Yes, so Geertje, you've set me up beautifully. What is a psychologist doing at a geochemistry conference?
So yesterday I was talking about the public perception of the extractive industry, of the perception of how is the sector perceived in general, and how does that impact the operations on the ground. Because I think very often that is something that organizations in the sector is aware of, but is also very much struggling with to dealing with in practice.
And with regards to that, I guess this isn't your first time speaking with a load of geochemists or people who come from perhaps the more technical disciplines within mining.
True, very true, yes.
And so as a psychologist, let's go back in time a little bit, because of course we might be here in Spain, but you're not from Spain, are you?
No, I'm Dutch and I live in Ireland, Dublin.
just to confuse matters.
Yeah.
So in terms of the Netherlands, so where did you grow up and what got you interested in psychology?
So I grew up in Groningen. I also did my master's and PhD in Groningen, which is actually an area where we have lots of natural gas, the largest belt in Europe. I got interested in psychology because I wanted to understand how people behave, why they behave the way they do, why they often don't do as you expect, and sometimes act counterintuitively. So I was very interested in the human being in general.
So you did your PhD in the Netherlands, and then where did you go after that?
So after that, I moved to Aberdeen, Scotland, where I did a postdoc position on the adoption of electric vehicles, which is also to do, of course, with human behavior and the interaction with technology.
So that's fascinating because, of course, there's a lot of talk about electric vehicles now. But that postdoc it was a little while ago, wasn't it? I mean, obviously you're only 25 now, but it was a little while ago.
It was 15 years ago, yes. I was so young.
And so what did you find with that study?
So in that study, and this was really when electric vehicles were first on the market, there was a lot of range anxiety because people really worried they wouldn't make it to the end of the trip. What we looked at in these studies is what is the symbolic value of electric vehicles? Because in those days, they were so novel, so innovative, nobody had an electric vehicle. Why would anyone even adopt them in the first place? They were massively expensive. There were issues with batteries and range. And what we see is that, at least in those days, lots of people wanted to adopt an electric vehicle because it was a status symbol, like cars often are. Now, that has changed in the last 15 years, of course, but still, you see in the different ranges that cars have a very strong symbolic function.
And doing that research in Aberdeen, which of course is perhaps quite famous for its link to oil and gas, how was that when you were studying electric vehicles, which is almost in competition to, of course, some of the uses from oil?
I think in the university, I did that clash or contrast wasn't quite apparent to me. And it was in a time where the oil and gas industry was declining a bit in Aberdeen. So you could see the pressure on lots of people because that change in the use of fossil fuels was it was the start of that declining.
Fascinating. So you didn't stay in Aberdeen, though, did you? Where did you go next?
I went to Denmark. So I went to the second city of Denmark, which is called Aarhus. I stayed there 4 years to do another postdoc position where I looked at another type of technology and we looked at smart meters in people's homes that were designed to automatically switch on and off electricity if and when the grid demanded it. Now, you might imagine that people don't like the idea that an external unit can switch off and on their electricity. And so we looked at how can you install that in such a way that that's an acceptable form of technology.
And what did you find with that? Did people what was needed to make it an acceptable form of technology?
So we looked at two things. A is how do you present that information? How do you present it? And often if you present it as a default option, you're going to get this new smart meter with this function. But do let us know if you're not interested. Then the adoption rate is way higher than if you ask people to volunteer to take it up. The second thing we found is if you install such a technology, it is absolutely essential to have an override button, not because people are going to use it, but they like the feeling of control. So just in case something goes wrong, you can say, stop it, I want to override this mechanism.
And so, in terms of the technology providers that you were working with for that, did they then adopt the findings from your research?
Yeah, to a certain extent. So we worked with Bosch, the smart meter producer. We worked with the electricity companies who were selling it, and they adopted that methodology in their approach to consumers.
So you mentioned that you're currently living in Ireland, which is not Denmark. So I'm assuming at some point in time you moved from Denmark to Ireland.
I did 11 years ago.
Yeah, the maths works.
Good. So yes, I then moved to Ireland to take up a lectureship, and I started off as a cross hire between the School of Business and something called the Energy Institute. And I was especially appointed as a psychologist to bridge the gap between social scientists and the engineers, and to look at things like the adoption of technologies, to look at things like how do people respond to changes in the broader infrastructure, like renewable energy, that sort of changes. And so I think I rolled into what I talked about yesterday, sort of slowly over the last years.
So let's dive into what you talked about yesterday. And a lot of that came from a research project, which is where we met. So Vector, which was a Horizon Europe research project. But Geertje, do you want to tell us what was Vector really all about?
So Vector was about looking at the environmental, technical and societal challenges around critical raw materials. The European Union needs a lot of critical raw materials. As we all know, demands go up and they face a lot of challenges. And now there were different work packages, of course, as one has in these European projects. And I was leading a work package on these societal challenges. And we looked at a range of different things. So we looked not just at how do communities respond to operation practices, to the extractive industry, social license to operate, but we also looked more generally at what is the general public perception, because that can influence how they vote, how politicians will deal with laws and acts and regulations around mining industry, what the directives are going to be. And so we looked at the general public, we looked at how can we engage general public in their thinking and bring them along really in thinking about the need for raw materials.
And what were some of the key findings? Because certainly from my experience, if you tell somebody on the street, "Well, no, you need this," many of them will turn around and say, "Go away, I don't want to speak to you."
So yeah, that's absolutely true. So one of the key features and results of the project is that in that conversation, the starting point needs to be that everyone is right and everyone is wrong as well. And let's have an open conversation about what is everyone's thinking, what are the first impressions and associations. And very often if you're very into a topic, you try and convince someone. You try and tell them what you think. But I think it should actually be the reverse and we should listen a bit more instead of talking.
Which I think is fascinating. In terms of be it us getting better at listening, do you have any hints or tips as to how we can do that better?
So there's lots of tools you can use. And for example, one tool that was developed in Vector by Lucy Blennerhassett and Fergus McAuliffe is an activity called Green Deals. And I think it's a really good example of a communication starter. And so what they developed is sort of an activity which looks like a game, where people go shopping, and instead of shopping for and paying with money, they're actually building technologies, and they're paying and they're paying with raw materials. And so you can have a whole conversation about which materials are needed for which technologies, which how many would you need? There's a shortage. So how are you gonna which priorities are you gonna set? Which technologies will you be able to buy and which ones won't you? And so it's a really good conversation starter. And they tested it out in many festivals, in public spaces. And in the festivals, people are not necessarily thinking about raw materials or these things. And yet they had lots of traction, lots of interest. So these are example things that you can find and activities to start these conversations.
So we've got conversation starters, but within that, it's not unusual we're expecting to hear something come back from somebody when we're trying to listen to them, but often they don't actually say what we're looking for. So do you have any suggestions as to, if I'm a geoscientist and I'm expecting somebody to tell me something, how do I open my mind and not perhaps be as surprised if somebody says something unexpected?
Now, that's a very good question. So I think what you often see is that people will respond with, sometimes it feels like irrational responses or emotional responses or total lack of knowledge. And I would take that at face value, except that's the level of knowledge that people have, that's the emotions they feel, and work on that basis with them. So if someone is very upset about something or has very little knowledge, you might start filling in gaps without overwhelming them, but start from their point of view and not from your own.
So I guess we lent into that when we put together the 100 Perceptions Raw Materials documentary. Do you want to talk about that a bit?
So you and I together hosted an evening in the National History Museum. We invited 100 people and we effectively put them through an evening of information, and not just talking to them, but they were involved in different games, shown them the minerals galleries, and we gave them lots of information. And the idea of bringing them in was then to see if their perceptions had changed over the course of the evening. And I think what's the most interesting outcome at the end of the evening, lots of people changed their perception, but not necessarily in one direction or the other. So some people became more positive, while other people became more negative about the mining industry, the need for raw materials. And that's just to show that you can inform people, but what they do with that information can go either way. But again, it's a very good conversation starter because they have more information, they make up their minds, and then you continue that discussion.
And I think with that continuing of the discussion, certainly since we made and released the documentary, so we released it in May 2025, certainly, I mean, I've had lots of people contacting me and almost say thank you for the respect and actually trusting us to have our own opinion.
Yeah, nice. So I've also used it lots in classroom settings. So students are really, it opens their eyes as well because they often go in with, they want to tell people what to think. And this shows them a mechanism of how you might actually convey a message without trying to convince people that you know exactly what it should be. And so I think as a template for how do we build these conversations, it could be a really good example.
Yeah, it's a very different way of kind of shaping science communication, isn't it? Or any form of communication, really, by almost trusting the person with whom you're conversing to actually use critical thinking and come to their own conclusions.
Yes, and the other element you see there is that when you engage people in the topic, they actually absorb that information way better than when you just lecture them or when you tell them. So, actually, by showing them through these games that there's a limited number of raw materials, that they have to prioritize, that they have to make choices, they realize because they're part of that game that that's the reality on the ground. Now, we can tell them 100 times, but this message is way stronger when they're engaged in that activity.
So when we were putting together the documentary, not only when we were designing it, but when we were editing it as well, we were very concerned about not wanting to bias be it the participants, but also viewers of the documentary. So we tried really hard to make sure it was neither pro nor anti mining, but also as well, I think our primary reason for doing that was because we wanted to be as inclusive as possible of all the different perspectives that are out there.
Yeah, no, absolutely true. And I think that's sometimes also seen as a weakness because some people would like to see an outcome or an answer, which is not necessarily what you get. It wasn't what we intended to be the outcome. And so it can feel a little bit like, okay, what's next? But I think what's next is that conversation.
Mm. And so, in terms of teeing up that discussion, if we bring that, I guess, back into the mining sector and what we can really learn from it, and also as a social scientist working with a project that, from other angles, may have people perceived it as being pro mining. Thoughts with regards to, I guess, let's start with being the social scientist, because there are others working in social science who would never have engaged with vector.
Yes, that's very true. So I think for any researcher, anyone in whatever field you work, you need to have an open mind, and you need to have an open mind to the different perspectives. People might say something you totally disagree with, And yet, there could be something in it. And it may not be what you believe in, but if you try and take their perspective and have an open mind and try not to be biased or dismiss someone who has a different opinion, then I think it's a way to start getting the full picture. And so I really enjoy working with geoscientists because they have a very different worldview from mine. You start from a very different perspective very often. The reality is also very different. And yet we often reach the same conclusion, but we move from two very different angles.
I love that. I love that kind of we go on different journeys, but also I don't think we often think that we are starting from a different place because we all think everyone starts from the same place as where we come from. Is that fair?
Yeah, we also often think that everyone is the same as we are, which is definitely not true. But see, one of the presentations just talked about acute deposit, and I loved it because it means that actually the speaker was associating a human element to a deposit. So I kind of felt a connection there right away.
I know it sort of summoned up this vision of a cute little cuddly deposit, and yeah, it's a small one and it contains all the bits and pieces you need. So it's very good for research. So I guess just to round off our conversation, Geertje, in terms of the learnings from the academic research that we've done and thinking about how do we try and ensure that when we are having to use or find or source the raw materials that we need for everything going on round about us, how can we improve the responsibility aspect? What can we learn from this research and pull into the broader world?
So I think what we can learn from this research is that the responsible aspect doesn't just sit in that idea that you have competence, that you don't break the law, that you don't go over, if you look at impact assessments, that all is within the boundaries of the regulations. That all is well and good, but that's not necessarily what the public always thinks is responsible practice. So the public also looks at integrity, at do you give something back to society? What is the benefit or the added value? And I think those aspects, they're a bit softer and less tangible and often overlooked. And so I think there's too much focus on staying within regulations and focus on ESG guidelines. Whereas that's not necessarily where the public puts the emphasis on responsibility. So I'd say build in more of the softer integrity, honesty, added value elements to the practice would really help.
So is it being more human?
More human or more transparent as well, but to a certain extent, and admit there's risks, admit that things can go wrong. Don't try and hide it, is what I would say.
Brilliant. So, Geertje, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. And I greatly look forward to you constantly stretching my mind. So, thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, that was my conversation with Geertje. And I think this episode highlights something that the raw materials sectors perhaps don't always spend enough time thinking about. People. Not communities in an abstract sense, not rights holders or stakeholders as a category, but actual people, actual human behaviour. How people think, how they make decisions, and how they respond emotionally to industries, technologies, and to change. And perhaps most importantly, how they respond when they feel they're not being listened to. One of the things that really stood out to me is the idea that communication is often approached backwards. When we care deeply about a topic, as many people do, our instinct is often to explain, persuade, or convince. We want people to understand the technical realities, the need for materials, and the complexity of the transition. But what Geertje's research suggests is that the starting point should actually be listening. Not assuming what people think, not dismissing emotional reactions as irrational, but understanding where those reactions come from. And I think that's a really important shift. Because if we immediately position ourselves as the experts with the answers, we risk closing down the conversation before it's even begun. Another aspect I found fascinating is the role of participation and engagement. The examples Geertje gives, from electric vehicles and smart meters through to the work that was undertaken in the Vector project, show that people engage much more deeply when they're actively involved in the discussion, rather than simply receiving information passively. And that's particularly relevant for raw materials, because this is not a simple topic. There are trade-offs, there are tensions, and there are competing priorities. People are perfectly capable of understanding that complexity, but only if we trust them enough to involve them properly in the conversation. The discussion around the 100 Perceptions of Raw Materials documentary really brings that to life. One of the most interesting outcomes wasn't that everyone became more positive about mining or raw materials, because they didn't. In fact, some people became more supportive while others became more critical. But the important thing was that they became more informed and more engaged in the conversation. And there's something really very powerful in that, because the goal shouldn't necessarily be agreement. The goal should be enhanced understanding and the ability to critically think about what that potentially means to us and what we can drive with that. Geertje makes the point that responsibility isn't just about technical competence or regulatory compliance. It's also about softer, but incredibly important qualities like honesty, integrity, and whether organisations genuinely contribute something meaningful to society. And I think that's a really valuable reminder, because industries often focus on what can be measured. Metrics, standards, ESG indicators, compliance frameworks, and those things absolutely matter. But public trust isn't built through metrics. It's built through behaviour, through openness, through admitting uncertainty, and through acknowledging risks rather than pretending they don't exist. And perhaps ultimately, through being more human. I also loved the broader message that came through around interdisciplinary thinking. The fact that a psychologist can sit in a geochemistry conference and contribute meaningfully to discussions about mining and raw materials tells us something really important. These challenges are too complex to solve from a single perspective. We need technical expertise. We also need environmental understanding, financial insight, and we absolutely need social and behavioural perspectives too. Because at the end of the day, the energy transition and everything else that goes along with responsible sourcing and the future of raw materials, they're not just technical challenges. They are human challenges. And that ultimately is what responsible raw materials is all about. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode. Responsible Raw Materials brings together voices from across industry, academia, government, civil society, and beyond to explore shared challenges and opportunities regarding those raw materials we so often need at the beginning of our supply chains. If you enjoyed this conversation with Geertje and would like to hear more, please feel free to go to www.responsiblerawmaterials.com to hear and see more of her thoughts shared through our annual and free-to-access global conferences.